12 inches by 8. That's the size of the one unexplained mark on the back of an 18-year-old's skull, deep in the soft tissue, no cut on the skin above it, no fracture underneath. It's the single most concrete physical detail this case has produced in 2.5 weeks, and it went public for the first time this week, read aloud from an independent autopsy report inside a packed room at the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago. No explanation came with it, no confirmed cause. What came with it instead was a forensic pathologist's own words, that he cannot rule out foul play, and two parents, 2.5 weeks into the worst stretch of their lives, hearing something concrete about their son's body for the very first time. His name is Nolan Wells. Before we get into what that finding actually means, what it doesn't mean, and how it lines up against the currents, the phone, and the contradictions already surrounding this case, if this is your first stop here, drop where you're watching from in the comments and subscribe for more true crime documentary coverage, because we're following this story from day one. And tonight, there's a lot to get through. This wasn't a quiet statement buried in a press release. It came this week at the 117th NAACP National Convention in Chicago, in front of a room full of people who showed up expecting exactly this kind of update. Attorney Ben Crump stood beside Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, and read directly from the report. NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson stood with them too, putting the full weight of the organization behind what was about to be said. And what was about to be said mattered, because up to that point, nothing about this case had come with actual medical language attached to it. Every update before this one had been process, timelines, statements, disputes over who said what on that beach. This was the first time either side, state or independent, had put a specific physical finding on the record. The venue wasn't an accident either. A national convention gets a bigger audience than a local press conference back in Mississippi ever would, and that's been the pattern with this family's legal team from the start, using visibility and public pressure to keep this investigation moving, rather than waiting quietly on official channels. Today's announcement was just the clearest example of it yet. Before we get into what Dr. Mitchell actually found, it's worth understanding who he is, because his background answers a question this family has been asking from nearly the start. Roger Mitchell is a board-certified forensic pathologist who has personally performed more than 1,300 autopsies. At the time of this exam, he was serving as president of the National Medical Association, one of the oldest and largest professional organizations representing black physicians in the country. Before that, he spent 7 years as Washington, D.C.'s chief medical examiner, overseeing thousands of cases for the district, and he's appeared on Dateline, Meet the Press, and CBS Sunday Morning, talking about exactly this kind of forensic work. That background matters because Christine and Elmore have said, repeatedly, that they wanted someone with zero ties to Mississippi law enforcement, somebody whose findings couldn't be waved away as biased toward local officials. A national medical leader based entirely outside the state, examining a body flown to him rather than working inside Mississippi's own system, funded by outside supporters instead of any government agency. Colin Kaepernick was among those who helped cover the cost. Checks that box about as cleanly as it could be checked. The timing lines up too. Mitchell received Nolan's body on July 10th, 6 days after he disappeared, 4 days after it was pulled from the water off Horn Island, meaning his exam came after Mississippi's own state autopsy, working with whatever the state's medical examiner's office had left behind. So what did he actually conclude? Crump read it out plainly. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. Before getting to the one finding that's driving tonight's headlines, it's worth sitting with what Mitchell didn't find. No fractures, no deep tissue injuries beyond the one area we'll get to, no lacerations to the skin, no fractures to the skull. Across nearly all of Nolan's body, this exam turned up no obvious signs of blunt force trauma. And that absence matters almost as much as what he did find. A body that had taken a serious beating or a violent fall usually shows injuries scattered across it, not concentrated in one place. That doesn't clear anything. It just narrows the range of what's actually possible. Here's what that discoloration actually is, in plain terms. This isn't a bruise you'd spot just by looking at someone's skin. It turned up during the internal part of the exam, the layered dissection of the back of Nolan's head and neck, sitting deep in the soft tissue over the occipital bone, with nothing on the surface to match it. No cut on the skin above it, no fracture in the skull beneath it. And because Nolan's body had already gone through significant decomposition by the time Mitchell examined it on July 10th, he couldn't say with confidence whether that discoloration came from an injury around the time he died, from the natural settling of blood after death, or from something else entirely. What he could say is that 12 by 8 inches is large enough, and unusual enough, that it deserved to go into the record rather than get noted and passed over. And that's really the point of tonight's update. An unexplained finding isn't a confirmed cause, but it is something real. For 2.5 weeks, this case has run almost entirely on second-hand material, a disputed video, competing accounts of who said what on that beach, theories about currents and riptides. None of that is nothing, but none of it is something investigators can put under a microscope either. A documented anatomical finding is different. It's something that can actually be checked against the state's own autopsy photos, against medical imaging, against whatever the toxicology eventually shows. That's a thread an investigation can actually pull on. Crump was just as direct about where this exam hit a wall, though. By the time Nolan's body reached Mitchell, the state of Mississippi's medical examiner's office had already kept back certain structures from his neck, specifically his trachea and his hyoid bone, before the independent exam ever took place. His organs were available to examine, but they'd already been dissected during the first autopsy, which Crump noted is standard practice before a body is released for burial. To be fair to Mississippi's medical examiner's office here, holding tissue back for further testing after an initial autopsy is routine, not unique to this case. The real issue isn't that the state kept those structures. It's that the timing of 2 separate autopsies meant Mitchell never got the chance to examine them himself. That gap matters more than it sounds, because the hyoid bone specifically is one of the first things a medical examiner checks when strangulation is even a possibility. It's a small, U-shaped bone in the neck, and a fracture there is one of the clearest markers examiners look for in exactly that kind of case. Mitchell never had the chance to look at it, not because he found something suspicious and got blocked, but because it simply wasn't there to check. And that's why Mitchell landed on the line driving a lot of tonight's conversation. Examining the back of the neck without being able to check the front of it is an incomplete exam, which means he cannot rule out that an injury to Nolan's neck played some role in his death. Mitchell's report didn't include a toxicology screening, and neither, as of this update, has the state's. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind confirmed the state medical examiner's office completed its own autopsy on July 7th, one day after Nolan's body was found. But the full report still hasn't been released because those results are still pending. Lind has said plainly that's exactly why they ordered a complete autopsy in the first place, to be able to say, one way or another, whether foul play or trauma was involved. Toxicology on cases like this typically takes several weeks to come back, and it's the one piece both the state's investigation and the family's independent one are stuck waiting on at the exact same time. Here's why that single test carries so much weight. In forensic pathology, drowning is generally what's called a diagnosis of exclusion. A pathologist doesn't usually confirm it directly so much as rule out the alternatives first. Part of the reason is a strange overlap. Drowning produces fluid buildup in the lungs from oxygen deprivation, but a drug overdose can produce something that looks nearly identical under examination. Without toxicology, there's often no reliable way to tell the two apart just by looking at the lungs. That's the piece that's still missing here. It's worth being precise about what that means and doesn't mean. If toxicology eventually turns something up, that wouldn't automatically erase drowning from the picture. It's medically possible for a death to be recorded as a combination of both, drowning as the immediate cause with a substance as a contributing factor, and a finding like that would typically still be ruled accidental, not a homicide. But to be absolutely clear, nothing in this case, from any source, official or otherwise, has suggested Nolan used any substance that day, or that one played a role in what happened to him. That scenario exists here only because it's part of the standard process every drowning case has to rule out, not because there's evidence pointing toward it. Whatever happened to Nolan happened somewhere in that stretch of water off Horn Island's northwestern tip, and multiple people who know that coastline well say it's more dangerous than it looks. Todd Terrell, president of the United Cajun Navy, has described the current there as a washing machine, water that rolls and churns in on itself, the kind of rip current known to pull swimmers under fast. Cajun Navy Vice President Brian Trasher, who helped run the search by air, told reporters the group tracked wind and drift patterns to figure out where to look, and that when they found Nolan, he was close to where he'd last been seen, not far downstream. To Trasher, that points toward drowning rather than someone leaving him behind. There's no evidence, he said, that Nolan was simply abandoned on the island. It's worth saying plainly what a lot of people picture wrong. Real drownings rarely look like the panicked splashing and shouting you see in movies. The body tends to prioritize breathing over everything else, including waving for help, which means someone can go under quietly, close to shore, in water full of other people, without anyone realizing what's happening until it's too late. That alone doesn't explain what happened to Nolan, but it does answer a question Crump has asked publicly more than once. If he was struggling, why didn't anyone on a beach packed with people notice? Even something as basic as what Nolan was wearing when he was found is now in dispute. Authorities have said he was recovered in swim trunks. Crump has said the Cajun Navy told the family he had a t-shirt on as well. Trasher has pushed back on that directly. It's a small detail on its face, but in a case already running short on agreed-upon facts, even the clothes on his body have become one more thing two sides can't agree on. Somewhere in the middle of this case sits a phone, a set of keys, and at least 3 different versions of Nolan's last few hours that don't fully line up. Start with the physical evidence. When Nolan's friends came back from Horn Island that night, they came back with his phone and his car keys. He had neither on him. Attorneys for the family say that detail wasn't something the friends volunteered to investigators. It came out later. And when the phone eventually made it back to Nolan's mother, the family says some texts and Snapchat messages appeared to be missing. Then there's the video, a cell phone clip filmed from a boat, capturing what sounds like a heated argument on the shore. Crump has said publicly that it's Nolan's voice on the recording, shouting for his phone back. But Trayston Shepard, a friend who was there that day, has told multiple outlets that voice is his, not Nolan's, that the argument started as a fight with his girlfriend, that another man stepped in and it turned physical, and that his uncle pulled him back onto their boat before it escalated further. Javon Williams, Nolan's best friend, has backed a version of that account too, saying the audio sounded too clear to have actually traveled from the shore. And then there's the question of what Nolan said, to whom, right before he vanished. The young woman he'd been talking with, known publicly only as Katie, has said Nolan told her he was heading back to rejoin his friend's boat. His friends say the opposite, that Nolan told them he was staying behind with Katie. Shepard's own account adds a wrinkle. He said Nolan told him he planned to catch a ride back later with a different friend's boat, not necessarily the one he'd arrived on. Crump has put the contradiction bluntly. Somebody in this chain isn't telling the truth. None of that answers what actually happened once Nolan was alone, but it's the clearest example yet of what's defined this case from the outside. A handful of people who were there, several different stories, and a family trying to work out which pieces to believe, while the people involved face intense public scrutiny of their own. Strip away the forensics and the legal maneuvering for a second, because underneath all of it is a mother and father who haven't been able to properly grieve yet. Christine Wansley has spoken publicly more than once since Nolan died, and each time, one word keeps surfacing: insurmountable. She's lost a parent before, her own mother, a few years back, and she's said openly that this is different, heavier, a grief that arrives in floods at unpredictable moments. She works in healthcare. She spent years talking other people through loss. None of that, she's said, made this any easier to carry. Elmore has been quieter in public, but just as resolute, pushing back firmly on any version of events that suggests his son simply chose to be left behind. What Christine keeps returning to is the last ordinary evening she had with her son. Nolan cooked dinner that night, salmon, baked, and proud of it, she remembers, and afterward, he hugged his parents, told them he loved them, and left for the trip that would end with his death 3 days later. That's the memory she's holding on to. An ordinary dinner, a hug, an I love you, and then nothing but questions. There's a reason that kind of loss sits differently than other kinds of grief. Researchers who study grief actually have a name for it: ambiguous loss, loss without a resolved explanation. When a death comes with a clear, settled cause, even a tragic one, grief eventually has somewhere to land. The mind can process it, painful as that is. But when the explanation itself stays unresolved for weeks on end, grief doesn't get that anchor. It just keeps circling the same unanswered question. That's not a small detail in a case like this. It's arguably the whole reason every delay matters as much as it does. Every week without toxicology, every gap in the investigation, isn't just a procedural holdup. For Christine and Elmore specifically, it's an extension of not being able to fully grieve their son at all. Back in Chicago, Derek Johnson didn't limit himself to the medical findings. As head of the NAACP, he leveled a direct criticism at how this investigation has gone so far, accusing Mississippi officials of being derelict in their duties. He was careful to frame it precisely. He wasn't claiming to already know Nolan was the victim of foul play, only that whatever the eventual answer turns out to be, the case deserved a real, thorough investigation before anyone got to call it settled. That kind of statement, coming from national leadership rather than a local chapter, doesn't happen on a whim. Days before this press conference, the NAACP's national board had already passed a formal resolution calling on Mississippi authorities and the U.S. Department of Justice to conduct a transparent, in-depth review of how Nolan came to be left behind on that island in the first place. Getting the full weight of a 117-year-old civil rights organization behind one case is a real escalation, and it says something about how seriously the organization's leadership has come to view it. The financial pressure has climbed right alongside the institutional pressure. At Nolan's funeral, Reverend Al Sharpton used his eulogy to announce a $50,000 reward through his organization for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Within days, that number had grown to $125,000, with former NFL player Terrell Owens and producer Tyler Perry adding their names and their money to Sharpton's. And Crump used today's platform to lay out exactly what he wants next. For Mississippi's medical examiner to let Dr. Mitchell review the state's own photographs and findings, and for Mitchell to be personally included when this case eventually goes before a Mississippi grand jury, not sidelined while the state presents its version alone. It's worth stopping here and being precise about where this update actually leaves us, because it would be easy to walk away thinking this case just cracked wide open. It didn't, not yet. Here's what's confirmed. A 12 by 8 inch area of unexplained red discoloration in the deep soft tissue at the back of Nolan's skull. No skull fractures, no lacerations, no toxicology results yet from either the state or the independent exam. An independent autopsy that was incomplete by design, because the state had already retained key structures from Nolan's neck before Dr. Mitchell ever got access to his body. And a board-certified forensic pathologist's own written statement that he cannot rule out that someone else's actions played a role in Nolan's death. Here's what's still genuinely unknown: whether that discoloration came from an injury, from the drowning process itself, from decomposition, or from handling during recovery. Whether the neck structures the state kept back would have told Mitchell anything meaningful at all. And whether toxicology, whenever it finally comes back, points toward an accident complicated by something in his system, or something else entirely. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in tonight's update, so it's worth saying one more time, plainly. An unexplained finding is not a confirmed cause. A pathologist saying he cannot rule out foul play is a genuinely different statement than a pathologist saying he's found evidence of it. Both of those sentences happen to be true about this case right now, and neither one cancels the other out. This case has already been bent out of shape once by treating a claim as confirmed before it was, with the video, with the early assumption that Nolan simply chose to stay behind. Tonight's finding deserves better than that same treatment, no matter how big that number, 12 by 8, sounds on its own. Zoom out for a second and look at the whole shape of this case, because there's a pattern running through it worth naming as we close tonight. The distress call about a boat taking on water, the GPS and location data, Katie's account, delivered directly to Christine, and now this autopsy finding. Every one of those pieces has done the same two things at once, added something real and concrete to what used to be pure speculation, while opening up a new, more specific question that didn't exist before. That's not a flaw in how this investigation has gone. That's just what a genuine, careful investigation actually looks like from the outside. Slow, occasionally frustrating, and rarely handing you the single dramatic answer true crime coverage sometimes promises. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. Nearly 3 weeks after he disappeared during a 4th of July trip to Horn Island, his family finally has one real, documented physical detail about what was found on their son's body. It doesn't answer the question they've been asking since the very first night. But for a family living inside exactly the kind of unresolved grief we talked about earlier, something real, however incomplete, is still more than they had yesterday. Mitchell himself was specific about exactly what's still missing. In his own words, the questions still standing are, what actually led Nolan into that water? What position was his body in when it was found? Was there water in his airway? Is there any sign of injury to the front of his neck, the part of the exam he never got to do? Any evidence of bleeding inside his skull? What was in his stomach, and what does that say about timing? And finally, what does toxicology actually show? Mitchell closed his own report the way any careful scientist would, reserving the right to revise everything as more evidence comes in. We're going to stay on this story as those results land, as the mutual phone inspection moves forward, and as this case works its way toward a grand jury. If this is the kind of true crime documentary coverage you want more of, the kind that waits for verified facts instead of running with whatever's loudest, subscribe, and we'll see you for the next update.